So in our final video that looks at the 2 terms of Jefferson as president, we look at foreign policy. How does he deal with nations that are not the United States? With Washington, we saw that he had to deal with England and France and Spain and Native American tribes. And with John Adams, it was primarily the French. Now with Jefferson, things are a little bit different. He has to deal with what are called the Barbary States. Now, the Barbary States of Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. So we're in North Africa. They were viewed as a collective of Muslim states that demanded payment from Western nations in exchange for, quote-unquote, protection from pirates. Now, this has been going on since the 1780s. Many European nations paid them annual tribute. And under Washington and Adams, we paid a small tribute in the name of conducting foreign business. But Jefferson balked at the high demands of Tripoli. And there were reports that some European nations paid somewhere between $100,000 and $300,000 per year. As president, Jefferson began preparations to confront the Barbary States head on. When Jefferson refused to pay tribute in 1801, the Pasha of Tripoli, so the leader of Tripoli, ordered the U.S. flag in front of the U.S. consulate cut down, which was their way of declaring war. Jefferson had already gotten Congress to commission the construction of 6 frigates, which, when Adams had proposed that as president and creating the Department of Navy, Jefferson was against it as vice president, but now he's more than happy to oblige. Now, Jefferson will send a squadron to negotiate with the Barbary States, but he'll increase America's naval presence in the Mediterranean Sea. So that's how Jefferson's term starts. Now, the next year, October 1802, the USS Philadelphia, that's a ship, the USS Philadelphia, was captured by Tripoli. The crew was ransomed, and the ship was actually anchored in the harbor as a gunboat. So now U.S. ships will be used against Americans. 5 months later, American forces stormed the ship and they burnt it to the ground to prevent it from being used against Americans anymore. Now, the turning point against the Barbary States will come 2 months later, when 2 American officers will lead a force of 8 Marines and 500 Greek mercenaries to capture a North African city that was controlled by Tripoli. Now, this is the first time that a U.S. flag had been raised in victory on foreign soil. And if you're familiar with the Battle Hymn of the Republic, the Song of the Marine Corps, they mention from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. It comes from this event. That June, the U.S. agreed to pay $60,000 for the soldiers from the Philadelphia. So in effect, we pay the ransom and we temporarily solve the issue and avert a war, which Algiers, one of the Barbary states, will seize American vessels again about 5 years later. Now, this incident does help raise American prestige, and it does add the Navy and the Marines as a fixture of the U.S. Armed Forces, so it's no longer just the Army. So we've got the Barbary War to deal with. We also have England. So, we won the Revolution, but then Washington had to deal with England, and England was still kind of seizing our ships with Adams. So what's the deal? Why are they still the enemy? Well, partially impressment. That's one of the main issues. And impressment happened in England when vagrants would be pressed into service. Press gangs would go out and search for people that they could man their ships with. That's where impressment comes from. They're at war with Napoleon. They need men. 10,000 Americans were ultimately impressed for the British Navy. Because often British sailors, if they were going to defect, they saw the horrors of war. They saw what it was like fighting Napoleon. They wanted no part of it. So they would hop on board merchant marine vessels, American merchant marine vessels, where American captains were more than happy to have them serve. So part of this deal with impressment is they try and board American ships to get their troops back. But 10,000 Americans were unlawfully impressed into the British Navy. Now, yes, Americans contributed to the problem, and the problem continues June of 1807. Because, see, Britain was going to search all Europe-bound ships for British sailors. So in June of 1807, the HMS Leopard, His Majesty's ship, stopped the USS Chesapeake and ordered them to allow them to search for British deserters that were on board. The commanding officer, the American officer of the Chesapeake, refused, and the Leopard opened fire, killing 3 and wounding 18. The public clamored for war because, yeah, it was an act of war. We tried dispatching a ship to England to get a British response to the attack. And that ship was fired upon. And one of the ships that were fired upon had Vice President George Clinton on board. Now, Jefferson was inclined to defend American honor through war. We've seen this with the Barbary War. But he felt that Congress would prefer, and the more practical route would be, an embargo. Now, an embargo means you're flat out not trading, not conducting business with other countries. He knew the embargo wasn't ideal, but he understood that by forcing all American ships to stay in port, it would temporarily relieve the main reason for the American outrage. And the outrage was the capture of American ships and sailors. It absolutely hurt American business because there was no trade with Europe. But it also hurt British merchants who protested for their government to change their policy. Smuggling through Canada, from Canada through Lake Champlain, becomes a huge problem, and the executive branch is given a lot of leeway to enforce it. Now, Jefferson understood the importance of commerce. He understood that. He also did not plan for this embargo to be a long-term solution, but realistically, it did at least help delay war with England for another 5 years.